The sledgehammer struck the ancient brick wall for the third time. Dust from nearly 8 decades of silence filled the air of the First Methodist Church basement. It was March 2024, and contractor Mike Stevens had no idea he was about to uncover one of Arizona's most haunting mysteries. When the wall finally gave way, something caught his flashlight beam in the darkness beyond. At first, he thought it was construction debris. Then he saw the skeletal hand, the tarnished ring, the remnants of fabric that hadn't seen daylight since Eisenhower was president. Mike Stevens dropped his tools and ran. What they found in that sealed sub would answer a question that had haunted Prescott, Arizona for 69 years. What happened to Ashley Mitchell the night she walked into church and never walked out? Before we go further into this disturbing case, if you're new here, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the most compelling true crime stories with the respect and detail they deserve. Today's case will challenge everything you think you know about small-town secrets. By the end of this video, you will understand how an entire community lived above a terrible secret for nearly 7 decades, and why sometimes the most horrifying answers still leave the biggest questions unanswered. Ashley Marie Bennett was born on a scorching July afternoon in 1931 in Flagstaff, Arizona. From her very first breath, she was described as a child who brought light into every room she entered. Her mother, Margaret, would later tell investigators that Ashley had been singing before she could properly speak, humming church hymns while playing with her dolls. By 1955, Ashley had blossomed into a striking young woman. She stood at 5'5", with chestnut brown hair that fell in natural waves to her shoulders. Her eyes were a vivid green, the kind that seemed to change shade depending on what she wore. She had a sprinkle of freckles across her nose that she'd tried to hide as a teenager, but had learned to embrace as an adult. Those who knew her said her most remarkable feature wasn't physical at all. It was her smile. Ashley had a smile that made people feel genuinely seen and valued. At 24 years old, Ashley was living what many would call a blessed life. She was a third-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary School in Prescott, where she'd worked for 3 years since graduating from Arizona State Teachers College. Her classroom was known throughout the school as the most colorful and welcoming. She decorated it herself every season, spending her own money on art supplies and books. Her students adored her. Parents requested her specifically. The principal, Mr. Howard Chen, had already told her she had a permanent position as long as she wanted it. But if you asked Ashley what made her happiest, she wouldn't mention her career. She would talk about David. David Mitchell had been her high school sweetheart. They'd met when Ashley was 16 and David was 17 at a church youth group picnic by Lynx Lake. David was tall, quiet, and kind, the type of young man who helped elderly neighbors with their yard work without being asked. He worked as an electrician's apprentice and had dreams of opening his own electrical business someday. Their romance had been the slow, steady kind. 5 years of courtship, chaperoned dates, and letters when David served briefly in the Korean War. When he returned in 1954, he proposed to Ashley on the same spot by Lynx Lake where they'd first met. She said yes before he could finish asking the question. They married on April 15, 1955, at the First Methodist Church, the same church that would become the center of the mystery 6 months later. It was a small ceremony, intimate and heartfelt, with 75 guests. Ashley wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. David wore his only suit and cried during the vows. Everyone who attended said they'd never seen a couple more in love. By October 1955, they'd been married for 6 months and were living in a modest 2-bedroom house on Granite Street, 3 blocks from the church. Ashley had already started decorating what she called the future nursery, though she wasn't pregnant yet. She'd picked out yellow paint because she told her best friend Susan it works for either a boy or a girl. Ashley's life had a beautiful rhythm to it. She woke every morning at 6 a.m., made coffee for David, and packed his lunch while he got ready for work. She'd kiss him goodbye at the door, watch him drive away in their used Ford pickup, then prepare for her own day. School ran from 8 until 3. After work, she'd grade papers at the kitchen table, plan the next day's lessons, and start dinner before David came home at 5:30. But Wednesday and Sunday evenings belonged to the church. Ashley wasn't just a casual churchgoer, she was deeply, genuinely devout. She taught Sunday school to the 5- and 6-year-olds, she volunteered for every bake sale, every charity drive, every community event the church organized. She visited shut-ins with Reverend Patterson, bringing them meals and companionship. And every Wednesday night, she sang in the choir. The First Methodist Church Choir was Ashley's passion project. She had a lovely soprano voice, clear and pure. The choir director, Eleanor Price, had told her more than once that Ashley could have pursued singing professionally if she'd wanted to. But Ashley was content singing hymns every Sunday morning and practicing every Wednesday night. Those who knew Ashley described her as someone who genuinely lived her faith. She didn't judge others. She didn't gossip, even when others did. She believed in seeing the best in people, in giving second chances, in showing kindness even when it wasn't deserved. Some might have called her naive. Others called her the kind of person the world needed more of. In October 1955, Ashley Mitchell had everything ahead of her: a loving husband, a career she cherished, a church community she served with her whole heart, plans for children, for growing old together, for a lifetime of small-town contentment in Prescott, Arizona. She had no way of knowing that on October 12, 1955, her routine Wednesday evening choir practice would become the last night anyone would see her alive. She had no way of knowing that the church she loved, the building where she'd been baptized, confirmed, and married, would become her grave. And she certainly had no way of knowing that her disappearance would become one of Arizona's most baffling mysteries. A mystery that wouldn't be fully solved even when the walls themselves finally gave up their secret 69 years later. October 12, 1955 started like any other Wednesday in Prescott, Arizona. The morning temperature was a crisp 52 degrees, unusual for a town that typically enjoyed mild autumn weather. By afternoon, dark clouds had rolled in from the north, and by evening, a cold rain was falling steadily. Ashley woke at her usual time, 6 a.m. sharp. She made coffee, prepared David's lunch, 2 roast beef sandwiches, an apple, and homemade cookies, and kissed him goodbye at the door at 7:15. She watched his truck disappear down Granite Street before returning inside to get ready for her own day. At Lincoln Elementary, Ashley taught her third graders about Arizona history. Several students would later remember it was the day Miss Mitchell brought in photographs of old mining towns. She was animated, enthusiastic, everything she always was. When the final bell rang at 3, she stayed late to grade spelling tests and prepare materials for Thursday's lesson on fractions. Ashley left the school at 4:30. She stopped at Miller's Grocery on Cortez Street to pick up ingredients for dinner. The cashier, Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, remembered Ashley buying pork chops, green beans, and a box of rice. They chatted briefly about the weather. Ashley mentioned she had choir practice that evening and hoped the rain wouldn't get worse. She arrived home at 5 o'clock and immediately started cooking. When David walked through the door at 5:35, dinner was nearly ready. They ate together at their small kitchen table, talking about their days. David mentioned a challenging wiring job at the new medical clinic being built on Gurley Street. Ashley told him about a student who'd finally mastered long division. At 6:75, Ashley began getting ready for choir practice. She changed out of her casual day dress into a nicer outfit, a navy blue dress with white collar detail and matching navy heels. She touched up her lipstick, grabbed her choir folder and her purse, and kissed David goodbye. "I'll be home by 9:30. Those would be the last words David Mitchell ever heard his wife speak. Ashley drove their second vehicle, a 1952 Chevrolet sedan, the 3 blocks to the First Methodist Church. She arrived at exactly 7:05.
6 other choir members saw her park in the small lot behind the church. The rain was coming down harder now.
And Ashley hurried inside through the back entrance, the one that led directly into the fellowship hall. Choir practice began promptly at 7:15. 8 people were present that evening, including choir director Eleanor Price. They practiced hymns for the upcoming Sunday service. Ashley sang beautifully, as always. Eleanor would later tell police that Ashley seemed completely normal, happy, engaged, showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. Practice ended at 9 o'clock. This was standard. Eleanor dismissed everyone, reminding them to arrive early on Sunday for a quick warm-up before the service. Here's where the timeline becomes crucial. At 9:05, Ashley approached Eleanor with a request. The choir's sheet music was kept in filing cabinets in the basement storage room. Ashley had noticed they were running low on copies of Amazing Grace and offered to go down and get more for Sunday. Eleanor thanked her and left through the main doors with 3 other choir members. 4 other members, Betty Carson, Harold Webb, Ruth Martinez, and Frank Sullivan, gathered their belongings and walked out through the back entrance. All 4 would later testify they saw Ashley heading toward the basement stairs. Harold specifically remembered holding the stairwell door open for her. She smiled and thanked him. "I'll just be a minute," Ashley said cheerfully. "Don't wait for me." They didn't. By 9:15, all 8 choir members had left the building. Ashley was alone in the First Methodist Church, or so everyone believed. At 9:30, David Mitchell glanced at the clock. Ashley should have been home by now. The drive was less than 5 minutes. He wasn't worried yet. Church people often chatted after practice, losing track of time. By 9:45, a small knot of concern had formed in his stomach. He called the church. No answer. That made sense. Everyone had probably left. He told himself Ashley must have stopped at Susan's house. She did that sometimes. At 10:15, David called, "Susan's home." Susan answered surprised. No, she hadn't seen Ashley. Wasn't she at choir practice? Now David was genuinely worried. He grabbed his jacket and drove to the church through the rain. Ashley's Chevrolet was still in the parking lot, rain streaming down its windows. The church itself was completely dark. David tried all the doors, locked. At 10:35, David Mitchell called the Prescott Police Department. Officer James Rodriguez arrived at the First Methodist Church at 10:52. He found David Mitchell standing in the rain beside his wife's car, looking helpless and terrified. David explained the situation rapidly. His wife had come to choir practice, should have been home by 9:30. Her car was still here, but the church was locked and dark. Rodriguez radioed for backup and a key holder. Reverend John Patterson arrived at 11:20 with keys to the church. His hands shook as he unlocked the main entrance. The 3 men entered cautiously. "Ashley," David called out. His voice echoed through the empty sanctuary. "Ashley, are you here?" Nothing, just silence and darkness. They searched systematically. The sanctuary, the fellowship hall, the offices, the Sunday school classrooms, the kitchen. Every door they opened revealed empty rooms. No signs of disturbance, no signs of Ashley. Finally, they descended to the basement. This was a large, unfinished space with concrete floors and exposed ceiling beams. It was used primarily for storage, folding tables, Christmas decorations, old hymnals, filing cabinets full of choir music. The filing cabinets were exactly where they should be. The basement lights worked. Nothing appeared out of place. But Ashley Mitchell was not there. By midnight, 6 police officers were searching the church. They went through it room by room, closet by closet. They checked the crawl spaces beneath the choir loft. They examined every window. All were locked from the inside. They searched the small churchyard and the parking lot. Ashley Mitchell had vanished. At 1:30 in the morning, Detective David Chen, no relation to Ashley's principal, arrived to take charge of the investigation. He immediately recognized the impossibility of the situation. Ashley's car was in a parking lot. The church was locked when David arrived. No windows were broken, no doors were forced. She had entered the building at 9:05 and simply ceased to exist. Detective Chen ordered the church sealed as a potential crime scene.
He interviewed David extensively, though it was clear the man was in shock. He began calling the other choir members, waking them from sleep to get their statements. By dawn on October 13th, a grim picture had formed. Ashley Mitchell had definitely been in the church. Multiple witnesses placed her there. She had gone to the basement alone, and then she had disappeared as completely as if she'd never existed. The Prescott Police Department launched an immediate and intensive search. Volunteers from the community showed up by the dozens. They searched every inch of the area surrounding the church. They walked through residential neighborhoods calling Ashley's name. They checked every business, every alley, every possible place a person could be. The Civil Air Patrol was activated. Small planes flew grid patterns over Prescott and the surrounding wilderness. If Ashley had somehow left the church and wandered into the forest, they would find her. But they found nothing. Bloodhounds were brought in. They picked up Ashley's scent inside the church, traced it to the basement, and then lost it completely, as if she had simply evaporated. By October 15th, 3 days after her disappearance, Ashley's face was on the front page of every newspaper in Arizona. Theories multiplied. Had she been kidnapped? But how did the kidnapper get in and out of a locked church? Had she run away? But why would a happily married young woman abandon her car, her purse, everything? Had she met with foul play? But there was no evidence of violence, no blood, no signs of struggle. Reverend John Patterson was questioned extensively. He had keys to the church. He had been at home that evening. His wife confirmed it. But could he have returned without her knowing? Detective Chen didn't think so, but he had to consider every possibility. Every choir member was interviewed and re-interviewed. Betty Carson, Harold Webb, Ruth Martinez, Frank Sullivan, Eleanor Price, all had alibis. All drove directly home after practice. All were devastated by Ashley's disappearance. David Mitchell was investigated as thoroughly as anyone, though it broke Detective Chen's heart to do it. The husband is always a suspect. But David's timeline was airtight. He'd been home. Neighbors confirmed his truck never left the driveway. He'd called the police within an hour of when Ashley should have been home. His grief was absolute and genuine. The investigation consumed Prescott. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was impossible. People don't vanish from locked buildings. They don't disappear without a trace in small towns where everyone knows everyone. Weeks became months. The initial urgency faded into grim acceptance. The police kept the case active, kept following leads, but the leads went nowhere. Ashley's parents came from Flagstaff and stayed for 3 months, searching, praying, hoping. Eventually, they had to go home, leaving David alone with his unanswered questions. By January 1956, the investigation had essentially stalled. Ashley Mitchell had entered the First Methodist Church on a rainy October evening and never been seen again, as if the building itself had swallowed her whole. Time moved forward as it always does, but the mystery of Ashley Mitchell never left Prescott, Arizona. In the months after her disappearance, David Mitchell aged years. At 25, he looked 40. He continued working as an electrician, but friends said he was a shell of himself. He never removed his wedding ring. He never went on a single date. He lived in the house on Granite Street with the yellow-painted nursery that would never hold a child, waiting for a wife who would never come home. The First Methodist Church struggled with the tragedy. Attendance dropped. People whispered. Some congregants couldn't shake the feeling that something evil had touched the building. Choir practice moved to Thursday nights. No one could bear to rehearse on Wednesdays anymore. The basement became a place people avoided. It was just for storage, they told themselves. No reason to go down there unless absolutely necessary. Eleanor Price, the choir director, left Prescott in 1957. She told friends she couldn't stay in a place with so many painful memories. The choir never quite recovered its previous spirit. By 1960, 5 years had passed. Ashley Mitchell was legally declared dead, though no body had ever been found. David held a memorial service. The church was full. People came from all over Arizona to pay their respects to the young woman.
The teacher who had vanished. David broke down during the service, sobbing so hard that 2 friends had to help him from the building. The 1960s brought new theories. Some people whispered about UFO abductions. This was the era of increasing reports of unexplained phenomena. Others speculated about secret government programs. A few thought Ashley had entered witness protection. None of these theories made sense, but they filled the void where answers should have been. In 1972, a psychology graduate student from the University of Arizona came to Prescott to write her thesis on the case. She interviewed dozens of people, reviewed all the police files, and concluded that Ashley Mitchell had somehow left the church unnoticed and met with foul play elsewhere. But this theory couldn't explain the locked doors, the car in the I-8 parking lot, the complete absence of any trail. David Mitchell grew older, quieter, more withdrawn. He developed heart problems in his late 50s. In 1988, on what would have been his and Ashley's 33rd wedding anniversary, he had a massive heart attack while working on a residential wiring job. He was rushed to the hospital, but never regained consciousness. He died at age 59. At his funeral, one of his brothers read a letter David had written to be opened after his death. In it, David wrote, "I never stopped believing I would find out what happened to Ashley. I never stopped loving her. If there's an afterlife, maybe I'll finally get my answers. Maybe I'll finally bring her home." The 1990s and 2000s brought new attention to cold cases. As DNA technology advanced, Detective Chen, long retired, pushed for the case to be re-examined with modern forensic techniques. But there was nothing to test. No body, no crime scene, no physical evidence whatsoever. The mystery of Ashley Mitchell remained just that, a mystery. The story became legend in Prescott. Children grew up hearing about the woman who disappeared from the church. Some claimed the building was haunted. Others said on quiet nights you could hear a woman singing hymns in the basement. Most dismissed these as ghost stories, nothing more. The First Methodist Church itself continued operating, though it underwent renovations several times. In 1995, new carpeting throughout. In 2003, a complete overhaul of the electrical system. In 2011, new roofing and exterior painting. Each time, workers commented on how strange the basement felt. Cold, they said, unwelcoming. But they did their work and left, never knowing what lay just beyond an old brick wall. By 2020, 70 years had passed since Ashley Mitchell's disappearance. Only a handful of people who'd known her were still alive. Most Prescott residents under 50 had never heard her name. The case file sat in the police department's cold case storage, gathering dust, a relic of a time when small towns believed impossible things didn't happen to them. And then came March 2024. The First Methodist Church had stood on the corner of Marina Street and Goodwin Street for 143 years. By early 2024, the building's foundation was showing serious deterioration. Engineers warned the I-8 congregation that without major structural repairs, the church might not be safe for much longer. The church board approved a comprehensive renovation project. On March 4, 2024, Stevens Construction began work. The plan was to reinforce the foundation, update plumbing, and address water damage in the basement. Mike Stevens, the company owner, had worked on dozens of old buildings around Prescott. He knew to expect surprises in structures this old, odd retrofits, forgotten rooms, architectural choices that made no sense by modern standards. But he wasn't prepared for what he found. On March 11th, Stevens and his crew were examining the basement walls when they noticed something unusual. The north wall, which everyone assumed was external, was actually thicker than the building plans indicated, much thicker. Using thermal imaging, they detected a void space beyond it. Stevens consulted with the church board and a structural engineer. They determined the wall was not original to the building. According to records they uncovered, it had been constructed in 1945 to seal off a sub-crawl space that had been deemed structurally unsound. The space was supposed to have been empty, just old foundation work that was no longer needed.
On March 14th, Stevens received permission to breach the wall. The congregation was curious about what might be in this forgotten space. Maybe old church records, maybe artifacts from Prescott's early city days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Stevens began carefully removing bricks from the sealed wall. The mortar was old but solid. It took nearly an hour to create an opening large enough to peer through. When Stevens shone his flashlight into the darkness, he immediately knew something was wrong. The north wall, which everyone assumed was external, was actually thicker than the building plans indicated, much thicker. Using thermal imaging, they detected a void space beyond it. Stevens consulted with the church board and a structural engineer. They determined the wall was not original to the building. According to records they uncovered, it had been constructed in 1945 to seal off a sub-crawl space that had been deemed structurally unsound. The space was supposed to have been empty, just old foundation work that was no longer needed. On March 14th, Stevens received permission to breach the wall. The congregation was curious about what might be in this forgotten space. Maybe old church records, maybe artifacts from Prescott's early city days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Stevens began carefully removing bricks from the sealed wall. The mortar was old but solid. It took nearly an hour to create an opening large enough to peer through. When Stevens shone his flashlight into the darkness, he immediately knew something was wrong. The north wall, which everyone assumed was external, was actually thicker than the building plans indicated, much thicker. Using thermal imaging, they detected a void space beyond it. Stevens consulted with the church board and a structural engineer. They determined the wall was not original to the building. According to records they uncovered, it had been constructed in 1945 to seal off a sub-crawl space that had been deemed structurally unsound. The space was supposed to have been empty, just old foundation work that was no longer needed. On March 14th, Stevens received permission to breach the wall. The congregation was curious about what might be in this forgotten space. Maybe old church records, maybe artifacts from Prescott's early city days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Stevens began carefully removing bricks from the sealed wall. The mortar was old but solid. It took nearly an hour to create an opening large enough to peer through. When Stevens shone his flashlight into the darkness, he immediately knew something was wrong. The north wall, which everyone assumed was external, was actually thicker than the building plans indicated, much thicker. Using thermal imaging, they detected a void space beyond it. Stevens consulted with the church board and a structural engineer. They determined the wall was not original to the building. According to records they uncovered, it had been constructed in 1945 to seal off a sub-crawl space that had been deemed structurally unsound. The space was supposed to have been empty, just old foundation work that was no longer needed. On March 14th, Stevens received permission to breach the wall. The congregation was curious about what might be in this forgotten space. Maybe old church records, maybe artifacts from Prescott's early city days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Stevens began carefully removing bricks from the sealed wall. The mortar was old but solid. It took nearly an hour to create an opening large enough to peer through. When Stevens shone his flashlight into the darkness, he immediately knew something was wrong. The north wall, which everyone assumed was external, was actually thicker than the building plans indicated, much thicker. Using thermal imaging, they detected a void space beyond it. Stevens consulted with the church board and a structural engineer. They determined the wall was not original to the building. According to records they uncovered, it had been constructed in 1945 to seal off a sub-crawl space that had been deemed structurally unsound. The space was supposed to have been empty, just old foundation work that was no longer needed. On March 14th, Stevens received permission to breach the wall. The congregation was curious about what might be in this forgotten space. Maybe old church records, maybe artifacts from Prescott's early city days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Stevens began carefully removing bricks from the sealed wall. The mortar was old but solid. It took nearly an hour to create an opening large enough to peer through. When Stevens shone his flashlight into the darkness, he immediately knew something was wrong. The north wall, which everyone assumed was external, was actually thicker than the building plans indicated, much thicker. Using thermal imaging, they detected a void space beyond it. Stevens consulted with the church board and a structural engineer. They determined the wall was not original to the building. According to records they uncovered, it had been constructed in 1945 to seal off a sub-crawl space that
Ashley's surviving relatives showed familial markers consistent with the remains. It wasn't perfect proof, but combined with the location, the wedding ring, the clothing, and the timeline, investigators were confident they had found Ashley Mitchell. But how did she get there? The most plausible theory, and it's important to stress that it remains just a theory, is this. On the night of October 12, 1955, Ashley went to the basement to retrieve choir music. At some point, she either discovered or accidentally accessed the old sub-crawl space. Perhaps there was a door or opening that had been inadequately sealed. Perhaps she fell through rotted floorboards. In that space, in the darkness, something went terribly wrong. She may have fallen, striking her head. She may have become disoriented and unable to find her way out. She may have called for help that no one heard through the thick walls and the sound of the rain. And then, this is the part that haunts investigators, someone may have found her, not to help, but to hide. The sub was sealed with new brickwork in early 1946, according to church records. But what if that wasn't entirely true? What if someone in a panic or with darker motives sealed that space in October 1955 with Ashley inside? Church records from that period are frustratingly incomplete. The building maintenance logs for late 1955 are missing entirely. Several members of the 1955 church board died decades ago. Reverend Patterson passed away in 1979. If anyone knew what really happened, they took that knowledge to their graves. The case was officially reclassified from a missing person to a suspicious death investigation. But after 69 years, there would be no arrests, no trial, no justice in the traditional sense. The Prescott Police Department concluded their report with a statement acknowledging the likelihood that the remains were Ashley Mitchell's, but noting that the exact circumstances of her death and the events that followed may never be fully understood. In June 2024, the remains were released to Ashley's family. They held a funeral, the one David Mitchell had longed to hold for 33 years but never could. Ashley was buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Prescott, next to the plot where David had been laid to rest in 1998. Her gravestone bears a simple inscription, Ashley Marie Mitchell, 1931-1955. Beloved wife, teacher, friend, finally home. The First Methodist Church struggled with what to do. Some members argued the building should be demolished. Others felt that would be erasing history. Ultimately, they compromised. The church was deconsecrated and sold. It's now being converted into a community arts center. Where Ashley was found, they've installed a memorial plaque in memory of Ashley Mitchell and all victims of unsolved crimes. May we never stop seeking truth. But truth, as this case demonstrates, is sometimes maddeningly elusive. We can know the what. Ashley died in or near that church in October 1955. We can know the where, in a sealed subspace that became her tomb. We can know the when, sometime after 9:05 p.m. on October 12, 1955. What we cannot know is the why or the who. Was it a tragic accident, or was it something darker? Did someone panic and make a terrible decision, or was this intentional from the start? These questions hang in the air like the dust that rose when that wall finally came down in March 2024. After 69 years, Ashley Mitchell was found,
But the complete truth died with whoever sealed that wall and left a young woman to be forgotten behind it. Some mysteries, it seems, are solved only to reveal deeper mysteries beneath. Ashley's family has answers now, but not all of them. Prescott has closure, but not complete closure. And somewhere in the unknown, the full story of what happened that rainy October night remains locked away forever. What we can say with certainty is this: Ashley Mitchell lived a life of kindness, faith, and love. She deserved so much better than what she received. Her story reminds us that evil sometimes hides in plain sight, and that the places we consider safe can harbor the darkest secrets. The First Methodist Church stood for 143 years. For 69 of those years, it held a secret that no one could have imagined. Now that secret is known, but not understood. Known, but not fully explained.